So, over my last 3 videos, I've explored how the dark side of liberalism relates to the left, trying to explore how the liberal history and its philosophical stances make many of its views incompatible with serious radical left politics. But, in these final 2 videos of the series, I want to take a different angle and ask another question, and one I think is possibly more pressing. What do the points we have raised, this dark side of liberalism, tell us about the relationship between liberalism and the far right, and specifically, fascism? Before I begin though, I want to make clear that my argument here has nothing to do with the book Liberal Fascism by Jonah Goldberg. I haven't read this book, but my impression is that it seems to be a deeply conservative text, which espouses some sort of horseshoe theory defining liberalism as left, and then effectively saying liberals are the real fascists these days. Another of these, the left are behaving like fascists arguments. This is pretty ridiculous and couldn't be further from my argument here, which should be obvious as I've spent 3 videos clearly differentiating liberalism from the left. But anyway, let's finally look at the actual relationship between liberalism and fascism. The relationship between liberalism and the far right is interesting at the moment, as the views of liberals on what to do about the far right sometimes seem to be split, sometimes even within the same person, declaring it as an evil to be stopped one minute, and then falling into line with its demands the next. So what really is the relationship between the far right and liberalism? So for the last 3 videos, I've generally been circling around an argument in large part set out by the historian Ishay Landa in his book The Apprentice's Sorcerer, and I've been looking at what this argument says about the relationship between the left and liberalism. But actually, this is not the core argument of this book. Its subtitle is Liberal Tradition and Fascism. I want to build on the points I've made so far to draw out this final and pressing part of the thesis, the link between the liberal tradition and fascism. Quick note here on terms. I'm going to describe a number of thinkers here as fascist, Nazi, or proto-fascist, and I am using those terms accurately. Proto-fascist for influences on fascism who are moving that way, fascists for actual fascists, and Nazis for people who are actually part of the Nazi regime. These are not terms for people I disagree with being used freely as signifiers. They are positions the people themselves clearly took. I also want to note that I'm not saying this is a single universal analysis of fascism that overrides anyone else's views on how fascism works or how we should relate to it, but I think this is an important framework which reveals a number of very interesting aspects of fascism and how it operates within society. So, in the first part of this mini-series, we looked at the liberal split, how the economic and political or social values of liberalism came to be in direct conflict once the liberal bourgeois replaced the aristocracy as the primary ruling class. Over the last 3 videos I've tried to point out that to logically and consistently defend the political and social values of liberty, equality and so on, we need to abandon the capitalist economics of liberalism and adopt some form of socialist stance. Redistribution, collective ownership, recognition of different societal oppressions on race, gender, sexuality and so on. But what if that's not the side you want to save? What if you take the opposite route and abandon all these fluffy social ideas and go all out defending the economic values against the errant masses? Well, Landa argues that this is how fascist philosophy gets going, through prioritising the economic values to the point that all liberal social values must be rejected to protect them. This is not saying that fascism and classical liberalism are the same thing, and what side of this debate certain publicly declared classical liberals,
I'm for what classical British liberalism,
are on is clearly up for debate. And perhaps I'd be more sympathetic than some commentators to people like Sargon of Akkad's claims to be classical liberals, but only insofar as I think classical liberals are terrible people. What I am saying is that fascism, far from being completely alien to liberalism, is in fact an outgrowth and intensification of liberalism in one particular direction, that of the economic paradigm, while wholesale rejecting the other side, that of social and political liberalism. The same could be said for socialism, which in some ways can be seen as an outgrowth of the social and political values of liberalism, rejecting the economic values, as I discussed in previous videos. Both solve the contradictions of the liberal concern for both social equality and exploitative economics, but in completely opposite directions. This may also serve to offer some explanation of why so-called ANCAPs, or anarcho-capitalists, and right libertarians have such a close relationship with fascism on the internet. Both reject a part of the liberal project, be it the state regulation of economics for the ANCAPs, or the limits on state violence for fascists. And both of these rejections are designed to protect the core market values of economic liberalism from the social values. Landa goes on to observe that this relationship between liberalism and fascism forms a historic dynamic, serving to preserve the capitalist economy which, as we have seen, liberals prize above all else, by enforcing a period of dictatorship. This is what he refers to by his title, The Apprentice's Sorcerer. As he put it, fascism became feasible because of the profound difficulties of liberalism in its classical form to cope with the challenge represented by that many-sided phenomenon to which we now refer as mass society. Liberalism, like the Sorcerer's Apprentice from the famous poem or story, called into existence forces, immensely useful at first, but which it subsequently could not control. Those unruly, uncannily multiplying mops, the modern workers, which refused to accept their role as mere tools in the production process and were gaining lives and wills of their own. So the liberal apprentice conjures a sorcerer too, in order to re-establish order, re-transform the animated brooms into plain wood. Fascism, in spite of words and gestures, came not really to do battle with liberalism, but primarily as an ally, albeit a bullying, patronising one, offering much needed succour, and it offered its services at a price. And this sums up the core of the argument we shall examine here, that fascism often acts as succour to the liberal capitalist establishment, helping preserve the economic order against socialist threats in time of crisis. But hold on, don't the far right hate liberals?
The mental disorder of extreme liberalism.
Aren't they constantly motivated by a desire to own the libs?
Of course, we have to return to owning the libs.
Well, yes and no. To examine this, let's start with a liberal turned fascist, and an influence on both Hitler and Mussolini, the Italian sociologist Vilfredo Pareto, who described his view of fascism and liberalism's places as follows. On the one side, the trumpets are sounding and the troops moving to the assault. On the other, heads are bowed in submission. The upper classes have become gutless and demoralized. They patiently endure every insult, threat, and oppression. They are only too anxious to avoid irritating their enemies, kissing the hand that strikes them. Even when a strike is beaten, they are too weak-kneed to follow up their victory. I will do the commons no wrong. The upper classes have followed this advice throughout the 19th century and up to the present day. In the past, the masses of the people was opposed not so much to the principle of paying taxes as to the manner in which the principle was exercised. Today we find it is the haves who accept the principle of being squeezed. Never uniting to throw off the burden, each one of them strives to push it off onto the next man. By such internal discords they make themselves even weaker as a social group. So for Pareto, the problem with liberalism is not its economic claims, its protection of the upper classes, but its failure to do so. Political liberalism is seen as a weight preventing the necessary forceful actions to protect the upper classes, which the liberals are seen as too weak-kneed to do. This may be unfair to liberalism, which has a long history of authoritarian anti-worker practices, but clearly not enough for Pareto here. Notice he clearly throws his lot in with the upper classes, who he says were being squeezed. But under liberal capitalism, were these not the very liberals he so detested? But if we understand how fascism relates to the liberal tradition, perhaps we can see this another way. An attack on liberals, yes, but not one aimed at destroying them. More a goading motion to the liberal classes, saying they have been bad custodians of their class position, but also an appeal to the liberal bourgeois to abandon their social and democratic values to protect their position. He's appealing to them as a falling ruling class, and asking them to recognise their class interests and end the attacks on their status. So what is the solution these fallen liberals are being called to? Well, another proto-fascist sociologist, the German social Darwinist Ludwig Gumplowicz, I have no idea how to pronounce that, but here's the spelling on the screen, has an answer to that. The false consequences must be corrected step by step back to the point where might, of its own right, as spontaneous factor of public life, undertakes the control of a society tired of revolution. This completes the period of evolution in the social struggle. From the freedom and equality of the anarchic horde, through might and inequality, right and law, to the freedom and equality of revolution and state-destroying anarchy, and from this unbearable condition to the despotic might of reaction and the beginning of a new period of evolution. So here we see how 19th and early 20th century proto-fascists sought to roll back the social progress forced on liberalism over the 19th century to restore the old social hierarchy. Sound familiar? Certainly, I think more than a few far-right opinions today could be seen in this way, demanding the rollback of feminism, trans rights, racial equality and so on, in order to restore the old social hierarchy of white men and their docile wives. And indeed, these thinkers loved liberalism's capitalist economics and its imperialism. Let's look at another of Hitler's influences, Oswald Spengler, to see this in action. Referring to the strength of trade unions and socialist parties in the interwar period, he said, "The natural centre of gravity of the economic body, the economic judgment of the real experts, was replaced by an artificial, non-expert, party political one. Have not the men with the creative economic talents, those who sustain private economic enterprise, been sacrificed to this dictatorship?" And elsewhere, he clearly espouses capitalism alongside what seems to be a precursor to the Germanic supremacist nationalism of the Nazis. "The wealth that has accumulated among the ruling class is annihilated by attacks of the mob. When it becomes suspicious and disdainful, then the Nordic will to acquire property, to power through property, ceases to create that wealth. The economic spiritual ambition dies out. Competition no longer pays. No race has such a strong instinct of possession as the Germanic, and that precisely because it has been the strongest willed of all historical races. Will to property is the Nordic sense of life. It rules and lends form to our entire history, from the conquering expeditions of the semi-mythical kings, down to the form of the family at the present day, which dies when the idea of property fades out. He who lacks the instinct for this is not of race." Spengler also supports an imperialist politics to back up the economic system, much as we saw the liberal thinkers and politicians do over the last two episodes, from Bowring to Blair. This he calls great politics, placing it above even capitalism. This is consistent with liberalism, in that it supports the relationship between imperialism and capitalism, but it does reverse that relationship, opening the door for the power politics of imperialism to potentially be placed above economic concerns. Although in the quote that follows we do see that the imperialism is still justified on the economic relations it upholds, so perhaps we can see these forces in more of a synergistic relationship, one fueling the other. For, as must be said again and again, the economy is no self-contained realm. It is indissolubly bound up with great politics. It is unthinkable without a strong foreign policy, and therefore, in the last resort, it is dependent upon the military strength of the country in which it lives or dies. But what is the sense in defending a fortress if the enemy is within it? If treason in the form of class war leaves it unclear whom and what one is really defending? Again, of course, there is an attack on socialism at the end, calling class conflict treasonous. So we see that these proto-fascists share these concerns we saw in classical liberalism of empire and capitalist economics at the expense of the masses and democracy. But am I strawmanning here by just talking about proto-fascists? What would a real Nazi say about this? Well, let's look at the realist Nazi of them all, the Big H. "It is therefore necessary to justify such traditional forms, which ought to be maintained, in such a way that they will appear absolutely necessary, as logical and right. And here I must say, private property can only be justified morally and ethically if I assume that human achievements are different. Only then can I ascertain, because human achievements are different, the products, Ergebnisse, of such achievements are different too. And since the products of human achievements are different, it's appropriate that the administration of these products will be accorded to people in roughly corresponding relation. It would be illogical to transfer the administration of a given product, which is bound to the achievement of a given personality, to the hands of someone with inferior achievements, or the hands of a collective, which, through the fact alone that they did not accomplish the achievement, have shown that they are incapable of administering it. So as we saw before, Hitler wants to defend private property from the masses on a basis not that far removed from what we saw in John Locke in Chapter 2. Further similarities between Hitler's ideas and the anti-democratic, anti-mass opinions of thinkers like Locke and de Tocqueville, who I covered in Episode 2, can be seen in this extract of a debate he had with Otto Strasser, who represented the supposedly leftist socialist faction of the Nazi Party, and was expelled by Hitler from the party in 1930 for being too left-wing, possibly sparing him the fate of many others aligned to the supposed left of the party, who were killed in large numbers in the Night of the Long Knives. Hitler responds to his stance by saying, "But your kind of socialism is nothing but Marxism. The mass of the working class want nothing but bread and games. They can never understand the meaning of an ideal, and we cannot hope to win them over to one. What we have to do is select from our new master class men who will not allow themselves to be guided, like you, by the morality of pity. Those who rule must know that they have the right to rule because they belong to a superior race. What you preach is liberalism, nothing but liberalism." And here we see, even for Hitler, the problem of liberalism is very clearly its democracy, its pretensions to equality, the political side which may lead to socialism. What he wants is a new master class, who knows that they have the right to rule as a superior race. He is abandoning the pretense of equality to protect the social hierarchy. The liberalism he opposes is political, not economic. This relationship between fascism and the protection of liberal capitalist hierarchies can be seen easily in cases like Italy, where Mussolini was invited to form a government by the king in order to shut down the powerful Italian trade union and communist movements led by figures like Antonio Gramsci. Or in Spain, where a progressive social democratic government had removed the monarchy and increased various rights for workers and women and so on, moves which Franco and the Phalangists vehemently opposed, and where the largest trade union was the anarchist CNT. Of course, there were very strong socialist and communist forces in Germany at the time, by today's standards at least, but recognising this trend in Germany is often clouded by the idea that the so-called National Socialist German Workers' Party was socialist in anything other than name. I'll look at why they chose the name in a second, but first let's look at the economics of Nazi Germany. It is often argued that Hitler's socialist edge was expressed in state intervention in the economy. However, as historian John Weiss points out, seeing state intervention in the economy under fascism as socialist is not really an accurate representation. Although both regimes interfered with the economy and directed business policies to a great extent, this should not be taken as evidence for the mixed or left-right character of fascist and Nazi rule. On the contrary, as in Germany, controls were intended to make militarism a means for eventually solving social and economic problems without recourse to liberal and radical domestic reforms. Hitler used tax relief policies, for example, to push production by heavy industry to a maximum, and companies were forced by controls to reinvest soaring profits in industrial expansion and government loans. So here we see that state intervention in the economy under Nazism was primarily aimed at securing high production for the military, aiming to use military demand to boost capitalism and paper over the contradictions of German class society, without any serious redistribution. So, far from left-wing intervention, most fascist intervention in the economy largely served to preserve, prop up, and remove barriers for the capitalist elite. Of course, it's not just in economic policy where we can see the capitalistic nature of Nazism and fascism. The arrest of trade unionist, communist, and anarchist activists certainly eased the social pressure on the industries and served capitalist interests. As Martin Niemöller tells us, first they came for the socialists, and then for the trade unionists. Of course, getting unemployment down, I'm sure, was a lot easier when you send everyone you don't like to a concentration camp, and companies can enforce whatever conditions they like because there's no unions. Hardly a left-wing agenda. And of course, although they like to decry the international finance system as a Jewish conspiracy to stir up anti-Semitism and channel concern about inequality into something useful to their ends, we know that Hitler was happy to do big deals with international capitalists like IBM, who ran data collection in concentration camps, or Fred Koch, father of today's Koch brothers, who built an oil refinery for the Nazi regime. So we can see that all their fluff about international finance is really just a cover for outright anti-Semitism. Not surprising, this is the Nazis. On top of all this, there's the fact that once in power, they, on the night of the Long Knives, killed anyone in their party they suspected of sympathising with the socialist values their party had pretended to agree with. But why then do they call themselves socialists? Well, I don't know if you might find this hard to believe, but the Nazis, those people who carried out a historic genocide and brought half the world to war, were not above telling fibs. Just as we saw in the supposedly ethical liberals before, fascists are also a bit into esotericism. I mean, Goebbels is remembered as one of the greatest propagandists in history. They do not have a reputation for honesty. It's just a lie. And just like the liberals, it's a lie to control the masses, as are all the ethnic lies which fascism tells, which we saw reflected in the actions of countries like Belgium in Rwanda in the last episode. Anyway, to see this in action, let's look back at Spengler. You see, Spengler, though a proto-fascist, described himself as a Prussian socialist. So what did Spengler's Prussian socialism look like? Well, Spengler excitedly praises the early capitalist workers, who worked 12 hours a day, 7 days a week, and says that the history of the workers since then has been a fall from grace because, from that time, the trade unions of all countries undertook to exert increasing pressure to reduce the working day still more and to extend the rule to all wage earners. Towards the end of the 19th century, the limit was 9 hours. At the end of the World War, 8 hours. Today, as we approach the middle of the 20th century, the 40-hour week is the minimum of the revolutionary demand. Since at the same time the ban on Sunday work is more strictly enforced, the individual worker delivers only half the original, possible, and natural quantum of what he has to sell, namely labour. What profession would tolerate so slight an output? For Spengler, this push against the working week is a bad thing. Thus his Prussian socialism is counter to Marx, demanding longer working hours so the workers can, be workers. He seems to think being a worker just means you fucking love working. Had Marx understood the sense of Prussian work, that of activity for its own sake, of service in the name of the collective, Gesamtheit, for all and not for oneself, as a duty which ennobles regardless of the kind of work you do, his manifesto would probably never have been written. So for Spengler, Prussian socialism is where workers are given the dignity to work 12 hours a day with no days off, so as to be the most productive they can. Sounds pretty crap to me, to be honest, and not very socialist. But surely, as he calls it socialism, everyone's at least equal, right? High culture is inseparably bound up with luxury and wealth, collected in a few hands and among the ruling classes, is, among other things, the prerequisite for the education of generations of leading minds, through the model of a highly developed environment, without which there is no healthy economic life and no development of political capacity. And, as we saw in earlier quotes, for Spengler, the masses claiming their fair share of the wealth they produced undermines the great Nordic will to property, or, in his more Nietzschean restatement, to power through property, which he sees as a noble trait. So the poor workers can't really hope to have a share in this elite culture or the wealth of the society. So yeah, in Prussian socialism, the masses work all the time so the rich can be educated and express their Nordic will to property. This of course feeds into the sort of national familial propaganda of fascism, where the leader is the patriarch of a national family. But doesn't that also resemble something we saw earlier? Remember in episode 2, when Edmund Burke described the relations under liberal capitalism in just the same terms, as a familial relationship, a tie of blood? It seems the fascist view of collectivism is actually very similar to that of a liberal capitalist. And as we saw in my very brief Foucault digression in part 2, the formation of systems of surveillance to enforce power relations in a prison, workplace, or society as a whole is an idea that starts with liberalism, and is certainly practiced by it today, and this is again something fascism is able to pick up and run with. And if you still doubt the insincerity of Spengler in his socialism, we can look at his own words, which seem very revealing, when in later life he said, "Here a great education is necessary, which I have called Prussian, and for all I care might be called socialistic. What do words matter?" Esotericism and lying are hard-baked into fascism, probably far more so than liberalism. But that's not to say they don't have heritage in liberalism's own anti-mass esotericism. The parallel between liberal and fascist esotericism was noted at the time by British writer G.K. Chesterton. "Mussolini does openly what enlightened liberal and democratic governments do secretly. This is not the same as saying that Mussolini necessarily does right, far from it. Quite otherwise, heaven forbid. What enlightened, liberal and democratic governments do is generally wrong. What Mussolini does is, in my opinion, sometimes wrong. But the point to grasp is that he does and defends what they do and do not defend. They conceal, they affect the same thing because they think it convenient, but they do not defend it because they think it indefensible. He is acting with his own principles of fascism, and they are acting against their principles of freedom." As a side note, this is a good reason not to debate with fascists, and to deny them public platforms to spread their views. Fascists are bad faith speakers and actors, by their very ideology. As Landa puts it, Those who wish to comprehend fascist ideology would do well to reckon with the fact that lies, myth-mongering and demagoguery were built into it. This means that anybody who treats fascists as sincere immediately fails, whatever else he or she might be doing, to take them seriously. When your maxim is power at all costs, it doesn't really matter what you say to get there. And they are happy to have a debate to platform their theatrical politics while hiding their worst and most publicly disagreeable views, and most likely trying to make their opponent look like an idiot, if they suggest that they hold some of the violent and racist views, which they clearly do. Some good examples to support this can be seen in my video Gab, The Fatal Effects of Hate Speech. So if you want to know what I think in more detail on this, have a look there. Incidentally, the racist and eugenicist notions of the Nazis, built on a social Darwinist outlook, can be seen to have their roots in the forms of social Darwinism, racism and imperialism, and even eugenics found in liberal capitalism, as we saw in episodes 2 and 3. In fact, many Nazis were impressed by eugenic projects in the United States in the first half of the 20th century, where racist and ableist eugenics programs were enacted in many states. To be fair, is it meaningful to even say ableist here? I'm not sure eugenics is a policy that can ever have a non-ableist form, but anyway. Nazi admiration for liberal capitalism did not stop there, though. Hitler himself explicitly idolized the British Empire. Different nations of the white race secured this hegemonic position in different ways. In the most ingenious way, England always opened up markets and immediately fastened them politically. Other nations failed to reach this goal because they squandered their spiritual energies on internal, ideological, formerly religious, struggles. At the time that Germany, for instance, came to establish colonies, the intermental approach, Gedankengang, this utterly cold and sober English approach to colonial ventures, was partly already superseded by more or less romantic notions. To impart the German culture, to spread German civilization, these things which were completely alien to the English at the time of colonialism. And elsewhere, the talk of the peaceful economic conquest of the world was certainly the greatest folly that was ever made the leading principle of a state policy. Precisely in England one should have realised the striking refutation of this theory. No nation has ever more carefully prepared its economic conquest with the sword, with greater brutality, and defended it later on more ruthlessly than the British. Is it not a characteristic of British statesmanship to draw economic conquests from political force, and at once to mould every economic strengthening into political power? England always possesses the armament that she needed. She always fought with the weapons that were required for success. So for Hitler, British imperialism was an ideal to live up to, one to which the imperialism of the German liberal establishment had, to his mind, fallen short due to romantic notions of German culture, which it seems, for Hitler, constitute roughly these political and social liberal values which he rejects. England was idolised by Hitler not for the pretty words of the liberals, but for the violent consequences of their actions. To illustrate the affinity between Hitler and British imperialism, let's play a game.
Welcome to another episode of Churchill or Hitler. And here is your host, Dumpster Flower.
I want you to have a look at these quotes and see if you can tell me if they are from Hitler, a German imperialist, or from one of the strongest advocates of British imperialism, Winston Churchill. Obviously, you can't actually tell me, but just play along, yeah? It'll be fun. So to start us off, here's an example which those of you who've been watching will already know because it's already appeared in this series. I do not agree that the dog in a manger has the final right to the manger, even though he may have lain there for a very long time. I do not admit that right. I do not admit, for instance, that a great wrong has been done to the Red Indians of America or the black people of Australia. I do not admit that a wrong has been done to these people by the fact that a stronger race, a higher race, a more worldwidely race, to put it that way, has come in and taken their place. And that, of course, is Churchill. So let's see if you can guess the rest. I cannot understand this squeamishness about the use of gas. I am strongly in favour of using poisoned gas against uncivilised tribes. It would spread a lively terror. And that was, of course, Churchill. And on to the next one. The white races did, of course, give some things to the natives, and they were the worst gifts that they could possibly have made. Those plagues of our own modern world: materialism, fanaticism, alcoholism, and syphilis. And if you guessed Hitler, you were right. Let's have another. I hate Indians. They are a beastly people with a beastly religion. Who do you think it is? Well, I'll tell you, it's Churchill. On to another one. There are no such things as classes. They cannot be. Class means caste, and caste means race. And if you said Churchill there, you're wrong, that was Hitler. How about this one? The peoples of Islam will always be closer to us than, for example, France. What do you think? Was it Churchill? No, that was Hitler as well. How about this one? Defeat is one thing, disgrace is another. Yeah, that was Churchill. And the last one. The story of the human race is war, except for brief and precarious interludes. There has never been peace in the world. And before history began, murderous strife was universal and unending. So the final answer is Churchill! Did you get them all? Did you have trouble getting any of them? I hope some of them were a little bit difficult, because that is the point I was trying to show here.
And before we go, it's over to Jim to see what our studio contestant is taking home tonight.
So, there is a picture starting to form here. Fascism is often sold to us as a historical aberration, something wild and unhinged, and totally alien to our society. A sort of collective mania that struck certain countries. Something so other and monstrous that, if it were to come back again, surely we would see it coming, like a demon with horns and fire, a Cthulhu-type figure emerging from a dark vortex. But I think the truth we're starting to uncover here, a much more chilling truth, is that fascism is not so different from the world we live in. That's not to say that it's not a terrible, abhorrent philosophy, but to say you can't always trust the devil to wear his horns, or tentacles, or whatever. Fascism is closer and less alien than we think, and I think this is important to remember, especially now as the far right rears its head into the political mainstream once again. This means that we need a different sort of vigilance. We can't be looking for caricatures, swastika-wearing men in uniform riding a tank into town shouting racial slurs. These stereotypes may exist, but fascists aren't stupid. They can hide themselves, and we should be aware of just how close some of the systems we have today are to fascism, and just how little it can take sometimes to drop the social liberalism and pick up the hard authoritarian stick of fascism to bring the masses back into line. When we are looking at fascism, we are not looking at a monster that is alien to us, but one we might see in a distorted mirror. Yes, it is ugly and horrific in ways, but it's also derived from our own reflection. Fascism takes the worst from liberalism, intensifies it and enforces it with greater might. But the threads it gathers are cut from the liberal cloth, not one of its own. In this way, I think, we should take some on the far right more seriously when they say they are classical liberals, but only as we acknowledge that this is still a very problematic position, and also that, if they were more fascist than classical liberal, they may just as easily still call themselves classical liberals in order to look better, because, I can't believe I have to point this out, but with so many people saying we should debate and listen to fascists and build bridges to them, it seems I do. Fascists lie. By design. Lying is a virtue in a politics which values power at all costs. Of course, this similarity also says something about our own societies, and that I shall come to next time, in the final part of this mini-series. So I hope to see you again then, for that. So thanks for listening, everyone. I hope you enjoyed this video as much as I enjoyed making it. And if you're really enjoying these videos, then why not throw me $1 or so on Patreon? There's a lot of time and work goes into these videos, and, you know, we all need to survive, and getting some remuneration for this labour would be fantastic, and the more you give me, the more chance that I can make more videos like this with better quality. So if you want to do that, check out the link which is visible at the bottom of your screen now. You can't click on it there, but you can type it in, or there's a link in the description. And I'd like to thank my current patrons: Emily Dickinson, Natty, Sabezian, Brett Long, Daniel Stenson, Geshtin, Sinead Kerwin, The Cooler Noah, and Thought Slime. An extra special thanks go out to Peter Benzoni and George Soros. You guys are all absolutely fantastic. Thank you all for your faith in this channel, and I wish you all lots of love and good wishes. I'd also like to thank Blue Legenda, who does the animation for these videos and is fantastic at it. And I'd like to give an extra special thanks to YouTuber Radian2Pi, who gave me a fantastic shout out this week, and that was really nice of her, and she makes excellent videos. She's just made a really good one about the garbage of capitalist economics, which I'll link to in the description, which actually marries quite well with this series. It even has a bit in it about some of the economic principles that are used in capitalism, which came from Vilfredo Pareto, who we had a look at earlier in this video, the Italian sociologist who influenced both Mussolini and Hitler, and whose work is still used in modern economics. So check that video out. And I hope to have the 5th and final part of this mini-series out next week, so you don't have too long to wait. So, apart from that, Happy New Year, if you're watching this around when it came out, or even if you're not. Happy New Year, whatever time it is for you. And thanks for watching, everyone. Hope to see you next time. Bye!